In this module, we'll be talking about task R3, or risk response. Identify and implement a preferred course of action in response to the risks determined is the task R3. Potential inputs include the authorization package, the risk determination, and organization and system level risk assessment results. Expected outputs for this task is the risk response for determined risks. Primary responsibility for this task is the authorizing official and the authorizing official's designated representative, and they're supported by a whole cast of characters. That includes the senior accountable official for risk management, the risk executive function, senior agency information security officer, senior agency official for privacy, system owner or common control provider, information owner or information steward, system security engineer, privacy engineer, system security officer, and the system privacy officer. For a new system, this does align with the system development lifecycle. For a new system, it aligns with implementation and assessment. And for an existing system, it aligns with operations and maintenance. It also aligns to the cybersecurity framework under IDRA 6, risk assessment. Risk responses are identified and prioritized. So let's jump into this task. After risk is analyzed and determined, organizations can respond to risk in a variety of ways, including the acceptance of risk and mitigation of risks. Existing risk assessment results and risk assessment techniques may be used to help determine the preferred course of action for the risk response. So we have to respond to the risk. Maybe that's accepting risk, mitigating risks, or transferring the risks, or not accepting the risk. These are all courses of actions that can be taken by the authorizing official. When the response to risk is mitigation, the planned mitigation actions are included and tracked using the Plan of Actions and Milestones, or POAM document we developed earlier. Once mitigated, assessors reassess the controls. Control reassessments determine the extent to which the remediated controls are implemented correctly, operating as intended, and providing the desired outcome with respect to meeting the security and privacy requirements for the system and the organization. So when we're going to mitigate a risk, that is, those controls are not implemented correctly and they introduce a risk to the organization and the system, we're going to mitigate them. So we put them on the plan of action and milestones to be mitigated. We develop those timelines and milestones and assign a responsible person. And then when the control is finally mitigated, that risk is mitigated, the assessor will come back in and reassess the control to ensure that it's working as it should be. Obviously, they'll update the assessment plan, the assessment report, and the system owner or control provider will update their documentation as well. The assessor updates the assessment reports with the findings from the reassessment, but they do not change the original assessment result. The security and privacy plans are updated based on the findings of the control assessment and any remediation actions taken. So it's important that the assessor does not remove the initial finding. This provides a way to have traceability from the initial assessment to the correction and how the system is going in its ongoing life cycle. The updated plans reflect the state of the controls after the initial assessment and any modifications by the system owner or common control provider in addressing recommendations for corrective actions. At the completion of the control reassessment, security and privacy plans contain an accurate description of the implemented controls, including compensating controls. So we update that documentation. We update the plan to show the way the controls are currently implemented in their correct posture. When the risk response is acceptance, the deficiencies found during the assessment process remain documented in the security and privacy assessment reports and are monitored for changes to risk factors. Because the authorizing official is the only person who can accept risk, the authorizing official is responsible for reviewing the assessment reports and the plan of action and milestones and determining whether the identified risks need to be mitigated prior to authorization. So the AO is the only one that can accept this risk. So we can mitigate or we can accept at this point, And the authorizing official is the only one. It can't be the AODR. It's the authorizing official that will accept the risk of the control not being in place and also not being built into a plan for mitigation. Decisions on the most appropriate course of actions for responding to risk may include some form of prioritization. Some risks may be of greater concern to the organization than other risks. In that case, more resources may be directed at addressing higher priority risk versus lower priority risks. And this is just the state of the world today. There's not enough money or people to fix every finding. So we have to prioritize the risks that need to be fixed and put our resources on those. And then if we can get through all those, we'll get to those lower priority risks. Prioritization is important in responding to risks. Prioritization of risk does not necessarily mean that the lower priority risk will be ignored. Rather, it could mean that fewer resources are directed at addressing the lower priority risks, or that lower priority risks are addressed later. So we're not going to totally ignore them. They still have to be addressed. We're just going to address them over a longer period of time. A key part of the risk-based decision process is the recognition that regardless of the risk response, there remains a degree of residual risks. Organizations determine acceptable degrees of residual risk based on organizational risk tolerance. So residual risk is that amount of risk that's left over after risk mitigation processes have been put in place. References to this task include Special Publications 830, 39, 160 Volume 1, and IR 8062, IR 8179, and the NIST Cybersecurity Framework. In this module, we discuss Task R3, its inputs, outputs, roles, responsibilities, SDLC, CSF, lifecycle alignment, risk response, risk mitigation, assessment report updates, updated plans, accepting risk, course of action, prioritizing risk, residual risk, and references. If any of this does look familiar to you, go back and rewatch that portion of the video. If it makes sense, on to the next video, or if you're in the course, on to the course content for further information on this task.